Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. We're your hosts, Nick Fenagoni
and Tanya Marco Viado. Our Queer Spirit Podcast spotlights queer artists, healers, practitioners, activists, and beings
who share their work and magic with our LGBTQIA, two-spirit, trans, and gender nonconforming communities and the collective. Our guest today is Ruth Camillia, they, she, aya. Ruth is a bilingual, bicultural healing arts practitioner, Reiki master, Akashic Records practitioner, and tarot reader. With maternal Indigenous roots from Los Altos de Jalisco, Mexico, they integrate curanderismo and other ancestral practices into their daily life and work. As an intuitive and trauma-informed practitioner, Ruth believes healing is sacred.
Today, Ruth shares their queer story about opening up to deeper authenticity and personal identity during COVID quarantine. We dive into Ruth's practice of Reiki and divination readings. Ruth does a live Akashic reading for Nick, and they share their insights. Finally, Ruth gifts us with a tarot reading for the queer collective.
To learn more, find them at www.ruthcamillia.com. That's Ruth, CAMILLIA.com.
Right on. Welcome, listeners. Welcome, everyone here to Queer Spirit Podcast. Welcome, Ruth. Welcome, Nick. We love to start our sessions off by grounding, so I want to invite the listeners and ourselves to maybe shift your position, close your eyes, soften your gaze, if it feels good, a little shimmy. And the invite is to connect to your breath, the natural inhale and exhale. As we ground in and anchor into our shared time today, honoring the elements, earth, air, fire, water, ether, spirit, all of our tools, guides, and practices for the greatest good of all, honoring the native lands that we reside on, Tongva, Kizh, Chumash, and Ohlone lands, and the people of those lands. Nick, is there anything you would like to add into our grounding time?
I would like to welcome and invite the muses and guides of mystery and potentiality.
Gracias. And Ruth?
Thank you for that. I would just like to show appreciation and gratitude for storytelling and for untold stories too.
Amazing. Thank you both. Collectively, we invite us to take just 3 inhales and exhales together. Yay. Thank you both. We're here. We're queer. So there. Super grateful to be here. Whew. Yeah. Feeling the energy.
Yeah. So for our listeners, we're here and we're going to talk with Ruth about working with the Akashic Records. And before we started the recording, Ruth actually opened the Akashic Records. So Ruth, maybe you could start by sharing with the listeners a little bit about what that means to do that process.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, first of all, I just also want to say how happy I am to be here and how grateful I am to be sharing this time with the two of you and your listeners. It was a special opening of the records that we just shared this morning. I invited Nick and Tanya Mark to join me in a pathway incantation, which is a personal series of words that I've kind of crafted as a gateway into opening the Akashic field. I studied and learned the Akashic Records through the Linda Howe method, which uses a pathway prayer, which has been so instrumental and really beautiful and helpful to me in my journey with the records. But in working with that, I kind of realized that this is such a personal practice, and why not craft a pathway that feels most resonant for who I am and sort of the energies that I like to work with. And so, yeah, it was just an honor and really special to get to share that with the two of you and have that be our pathway into the records together.
Amazing. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for doing that. Listeners, we're here today with Ruth Camillia, Akashic Record practitioner, tarot reader, Reiki master, an amazing human, period, punto. And we're so lucky to have her here today to share a bit of her queer story and to share about the medicine and magic that she is sharing with our collective. So we're so grateful to have you here, Ruth.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm grateful to be here. It feels so nice.
And we do like to connect the queer dots. So for our listeners, Ruth and I met in Akashic Record Study Hall. We both learned Akashic Records under our lovely badass teacher, Leah Garza, Crystals of Arta Mira. And so we met there, and the way that the network works, we kind of felt this little ping towards one another. So we were like chatting with one another, and lo and behold, we have some common denominators. So we both grew up in Orange County, Santana. We both attended the same high school, not at the same time, but we did end up attending the same Catholic high school. And we just ended up having a lot of magical connect the dot common denominators. So Ruth and I have cultivated connection through 2020 and 2021. Ruth and I were called to facilitate a Tuesday night virtual offering called Tune In and Up, where we offered breathwork and Reiki to the collective. So, yeah, such an honor to be here with you today.
It's such an honor for me too, friend. Yeah, as you mentioned, we just were really fortunate, especially at a time where I think so many of us were kind of feeling a bit isolated and looking for a sense of community and connection. It was really special and actually instrumental for me to get to make a new friend in the midst of, just a bit of a murky time. And I thought it might be fun to share with the listeners too a little bit about our personal connection, Tanya Mark, and so that the listeners are aware of sort of the consensual language that we use to describe our connection. So we refer to each other as bro, amiga. So if you hear those slip out during our conversation today, it's all with love and complete agreement on where we stand.
Yeah, thank you.
Beautiful. So, Ruth, we always like to start out our interviews by getting a little bit of origin story of folks. So I wonder if you could start by sharing a little bit of your queer story with our listeners.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Thank you for the opportunity to share this. I really value queer stories. It's what has helped me really gain a deeper understanding of who I am and what I'm here to do. So storytelling has been a really big part of my life since I could remember. And I believe that that's where I first started to make discoveries around my queerness. From a very early age, I just actually was in first grade that I participated in a poetry contest at my first through eighth grade Catholic school, St. Joseph in Santana, California. And it was that expression of poetry and language and being able to perform that on stage in front of my entire school. It just really felt good. I felt like this is where I belong. And I can look back on that time now and kind of recognize that as being sort of the beginning of my queer story. I always looked for like performance and storytelling in all forms through literature, books, movies. I was always searching for parts of myself in other people, in other characters. And I think what I was really looking for was a sense of acceptance, belonging, and understanding. I didn't always see myself being represented in my own community, and not to anyone's fault by any means. I think that I see now that so many different aspects of my identity lie in the in-between. So I'm a very kind of liminal, borderless person in truly all aspects of my being. And my queerness is such a reflection of that and such a safe space for me to be exactly who I am in all my facets. And so, I'm culturally a mixed person. I'm white and I'm also Indigenous Mexican and identify as Chicanx. And I love the way that language affords us a way of feeling seen and heard and accepted. And even when it's not perfect, I think it's like we're ever evolving. It's good enough because we're enough. And so I see queerness similar to the way I see how I identify as Chicanx, right? That there is space for me to be exactly who I am in my complexities. And so, yeah, I think so. I'm bisexual and I'm also non-binary, which again is those are among those circumstances where it's like, yeah, I don't live in the part there or here. It's everywhere. It's a yes and for me. And so I think I've always been really fortunate to have queer loved ones and friends within and around my circles. And so it's definitely in those people and the storytelling that has afforded me the opportunity to see myself being reflected. And I talked a little bit about the significance of 2020 and how that major collective shift allowed a lot of us the time and the opportunity to do some deeper diving and self-reflection and healing, right? And Bell Hooks says this, like, healing is an act of communion. It's rarely ever done in isolation. And so, yeah, it was listening to other people's stories and just observing, quietly observing, that made me really come to an understanding about who I am in my queerness. I was paying a lot of attention to nature in ways that I've always appreciated nature, but I think I was really craving it as a healing tool. And I remember in early 2020, I kept noticing this bird that I hadn't ever noticed that's always been there. It's called the black phoebe. And I was like, what is this cute little bird that keeps showing up for me? And I started to do some research on it because I needed to know everything I could know about it. And I discovered that black phoebes are essentially genderless. And I thought, wow, there's a message here for me. And it was just at a time where I was kind of starting to explore what queerness meant, not only for my sexuality, but for my gender expression too. And Tanya Mark and another dear friend of mine, Salvador de la Torre, were both friends that were just really open and sincere and loving and accepting to me in a period where they were also like in transition around their own gender expression and feeling, just kind of showing and leading through example. I almost felt like I've always been in the same swimming pool as all of my queer friends and people I admire, but maybe for a long part of my life, I was more on the shallow end and just kind of admiring those that were, frolicking and playing so freely on the deep end and just kind of building up the courage to, dive in a little deeper. And so I ended up sharing, so many of my friends already knew about my queerness, whether we spoke about it or not. I think that, I think to my adolescence and the connections I've always shared with friends that don't necessarily conform to societal norms. I've always been a really affectionate, kind of loving person. So cuddling and holding hands with my friends platonically was just a kind of a part of my person and my expression of love and how I like to give and receive it. And so, yeah, just being in reflection around that helped me understand my queerness. And I felt like it was important to articulate that and share that with my family, which isn't something that I had really fully expressed yet. And so I remember sitting on my parents' porch. We were still in, essentially in lockdown. So we were maintaining our distance and, sitting outdoors. And it was Pride of 2020. And I said, Mom and Dad, it's Pride. It's Gay Pride this week. And if you didn't already know this about me, I think it's important for you to know that I'm a queer person. I'm bi and I'm also exploring my gender expression, and my parents are just so loving and accepting. And it was never a question of whether or not they would accept me in that way. It was just really special for us to kind of have those conversations together. And by the end of that conversation, my dad actually said to me, I really appreciate the way that you express this. I really actually resonate with what you shared. And I think I'm queer too. And so I wished my dad a happy Pride that day. And yeah, I think that, there's been many iterations of my queer story, but that kind of felt like a bit of a significant moment in time too. So here I am.
It's so rad that thank you for connecting the dots of storytelling, and thank you for bringing in the energy of the first grader, Ruth, who I'm sure was just a fucking phenomenal being, period, and how you were able to look for queerness in identifying that in storytelling and what was around you, and how community played such a huge role in your queerness, as well as family. I love that story that you share. And shout out to our bro Salva. And thank you to the medicine of Black Phoebes. By the way, every time Ruth and I hang out, we are visited by either a hawk or Black Phoebe.
True.
So
Yes. Yeah, we get to share that animal medicine. That's part of one of our many connections. Very special.
I also really like that by you coming out, it helped your dad to come out in that way.
Right?
That you made space for that.
Thank you.
That your courage allowed him to feel brave enough to share that. I mean, I don't know if he'd ever shared that with your mom before, but, he hadn't shared it with you. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. No. I'm not sure if he had shared it with my mom yet at that point, but she didn't seem very surprised by it. So I get the hunch that he had. Yeah, I think it was important for me to be authentic and open with my family because I am a tia. I have 7 nibblings, and they've been some of my greatest teachers and supporters and truly my best friends. So it sort of felt important, a bit like a responsibility for me to be able to, represent for them and also let them know that I'm here and I love them for all of who they are, and they can be free being exactly who they are with me.
yes, modeling one of the potent medicines that we carry with us. I guess there's just no easy way to ease into your magic, Ruth, because there's so much about your magic that you have to offer to the collective. And listeners, when I say that, it's true. Ruth is a Reiki master and incredibly talented in that way, a tarot reader, which we might get a little snack from. And we chose today to actually have Ruth share a little bit more about the Akashic Records. Specifically, we wanted to invite Ruth and Nick, who's not had experience with the records, to explore that here on our episode today. So I'm going to turn it over to you two to get into some magic.
Well, Ruth, I wonder if you want to start by sharing with listeners who are kind of like me, who are like, I've heard of these things, and I don't really know what it is, like, what's going on here. So maybe tell us a little bit more about how you got introduced to the Akashic Records and what your experience of them are.
Oh, I would love that. Thanks, Nick. Yes. Just as you had described, what is that? I don't know. Interesting. The Akashic Records. That was my introduction to the Akashic Records. I had heard about it. And when I heard about it, I felt like I'd heard about it before, but I didn't know where from. It really piqued a curiosity in me. And it may have come about through listening to a podcast or reading a book. I think in the last 5 or 6 years, really kind of doing a lot of shadow work and tending to an experience I would describe as a dark night of the soul. And so I think that the Akashic Records kind of came into my life at a moment where I really benefited most. And I find that that's often the case. I've heard other people's stories of working with the records and how it came to be. And many of us, I think, share that in common. It's like, we don't have to look for them. They find us. So it's really cool. The Akashic Records are essentially an etheric kind of liminal space. The word Akash is Sanskrit for ether, which is the fifth element, right? It exists within and around us. It's non-tangible, but it's also permeable, I would say. And the idea is not exclusive to the Akashic Records practice. What's really special and potent about the Akashic Records is that it's a concept that has existed maybe forever across timelines and cultures. Sometimes it's referred to as the Book of Life or the Tree of Life. So there's a lot of Native and Indigenous communities and cultures that recognize the Akashic Records in their own right. And so that really interested me because I felt like this is something that we all are invited to access and that we all have essentially a right to access. So with that, we have this idea of almost like I sometimes visualize or notice the Akashic field almost in a way that's similar to the internet, because just as the internet provides such a range of information, so do the Akashic Records. The Akashic Records essentially contain every possibility that has ever or would ever exist. And so with the internet, we'll type our questions into Google search engine and all of these answers will come up. And then we have the ability to kind of discern and look at what the answers are and find what resonates for us. Okay, that's the answer I was looking for. So it's similar to the Akashic Records in that way, where we'll sometimes pose questions and receive a range of responses to those questions. And so I kind of like working with questions in the Akashic Records and drafting them in these ways that help provide, again, a range of responses so that we can kind of work together to see what responses resonate for us.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in my experience, I've had a similar practice in terms of other divination methods, in terms of like the way that you phrase a question and having it, not just be a yes no question, and have it be open ended and that kind of thing. So, can you give an example of some questions that maybe past people that you've worked with have kind of asked, so listeners have an idea of like what kinds of questions people come up with?
Yeah, absolutely. I love crafting questions together with people when I'm working in the records. I think that that's part of the magic already. As we're coming up with the questions, we're already sharing medicine. We're already in communion, right? And so I've actually kept a log of questions that I've asked personally and other ones that I felt were really kind of juicy that people have asked in my presence. So as you mentioned, leaving things a bit more open-ended, I find is always a plus if you can. So things like diving into past lives or karmic contracts, like a question could be, how can I better understand my own karmic cycles? Are there any contracts that can be closed or completed now? What are some ways I can clear and release these cycles or other programming? And then other things like helping us better understand our limiting beliefs, perhaps, like what are some limiting beliefs or ideas I'm currently holding on to? When and how did I adopt these beliefs? Am I ready to let go of these thoughts? How can I release and renew my mindset for the highest good? And just allowing the subconscious to kind of come to the forefront. It's really supportive in the Akashic field. I find that so often the Akashic Records serves as kind of this meeting ground for us and our spirit teams. So all of our guides are generally present in that space. I always sense this kind of eagerness or excitement when I enter the records where it's like, oh, here we are, we're all together now. And, the guides are excited just as I am. And sometimes their voices or energy come through in the responses that I receive. And that's always quite interesting to explore.
So you used a word that I'd like to maybe unpack a little bit which is karmic contracts, karma, people, and that comes up a lot in popular culture. And I think that people have a misconception about what it actually is. Like a lot of people think about like fate, quote unquote, with karma, like, oh, well, it's karma, I can't change it kind of thing. But I wonder if you can share more about like your understanding of what that is.
Yeah. Well, at its core, right, karma, the word karma comes from the Buddhist tradition. And so I can't speak very deeply on this because I am not Buddhist, but I certainly respect and understand some of the principles. So the idea to me and my understanding around karma is that energy that we put out through our actions, through our words, through all of our experiences have a great impact, not only on ourselves, but our experiences and the people that we come into contact with. And so I kind of recognize karma as an exchange of energy, and that energy doesn't have limits or timelines, right? And so karmic contracts or cycles can mean a lot of different things. It can be representative of our current timeline and experience, and it could also be indicative of past experiences that our soul has traversed. So that's the way I look at it. And I don't see it as, positive or negative. I know that it does, you're right, Nick, have some connotations attached with it. When we talk, oh, that's bad karma, you hear that a lot. But karma could be also like the good that we put out, the love that we share, and the positive thoughts that we have, and the way those kind of come back and find their way to us.
So I think that maybe now would be the good time to start the reading, because then listeners will just get an idea of what it is instead of just talking about it. Does that sound good?
I would love that. Yeah, that sounds great. And I don't know if you're open to sharing, Nick, but I think it would be neat to have you describe a little bit of the experience we shared before recording and drafting up a question that felt good for you.
So for our listeners, Ruth and I chatted a little bit before we started recording to sort of expedite the process of coming up with a question. But the general wondering or curiosity I originally proposed was feeling like things are starting to shift, particularly in my work life as a psychotherapist in private practice, but also wanting to incorporate other practices, and also having some health issues this summer that prevented me from like really doing the things that bring me joy, because I was like, well, I'm not really working so much, and why don't I go on vacation? And then that didn't happen. So feeling a little bit of confusion, like what am I supposed to be doing? Just feeling kind of stuck and frozen in this limbo place. And I think one of the words that Ruth thought was helpful that I mentioned was feeling like a pivot. Is there a pivot that I need to have in terms of my practice as a therapist, or there is a pivot that needs to happen in my life? Or is there sort of maybe not a pivoting, but more of a broadening or an opening in terms of like, is there something that I'm not noticing or not letting in? So, and then Ruth distilled all that into these questions that she will now read, I think.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, so well said. So in your sharing of that, the question that we've crafted is a bit of a two-parter, which often happens when we dive in this way. We want to make it juicy. We want to get as much out of it as we can, right? So we wrote, is there a pivot in the direction that best aligns for Nick's highest and best? What steps can Nick take to welcome a positive change in alignment with his desires? And so I would love to invite you, Nick. The way that I most appreciate connecting with the records is doing this in collaboration. And so if you could also have a pen and paper handy to do a little bit of automatic writing with me. That's the divination tool we're going to be using in the records together. Just a pen and paper.
All right, I have my pen and paper ready.
Beautiful. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 4 minutes to do a little bit of automatic writing. There's no rules here, right? So it could be words or 3 sentences, really whatever just flows and comes through. If you could make note of it, I'm going to be doing the same in response to these questions. So we'll take that 4-minute pause and we'll reconvene and share with the listeners what comes up.
Okay. Do you want to read the question one more time for me so I can?
Yes. So the question is there a pivot in the direction that best aligns for Nick's highest and best? What steps can Nick take to welcome a positive change in alignment with his desires?
Okay, great. So we're going to take a 4-minute pause. I want to pause briefly and invite you to join the Queer Spirit community. This is a new private space, free from the distractions of our previous Facebook group. Here we can gather together in a virtual community of our own co-creation to continue discussions on the topics from the podcast, but most of all to connect with other queer folks on a spiritual path. To join us in our new space, simply go to queerspirit.mn.co. That's queerspirit.m as in Mary, n as in Nancy.co. You can also find the link in the show notes. Okay, now back to our conversation. Okay, so it's been 4 minutes and Ruth and I have both done our own writing.
Yes, and I am so excited and curious to hear from you, Nick. This is kind of my favorite part of this practice where we get to exchange messages and see what's come up and how we can kind of connect some dots together. Are you open to sharing your reflections first?
Yeah.
Awesome.
So I tend to be very visual often with this kind of stuff, and sometimes it's very clear and sometimes it's more of analogy or metaphorical. So I think there's a little bit of that, or a lot of that here. So the image that came to mind is the work that needs to happen or can happen is a widening of a stream to be broader, more like a river with a gentle curve in it. And the image of me, I had an image of me standing in the water with my shoes off. So that sort of idea of you've got to get your feet wet kind of thing. And moving away rocks and stones in the stream to sort of make it wider, and then carving away some of the sand to sort of allow for this gentle curve. It's not a very sharp curve. And by doing this, will allow more clear water and energy to flow more freely. And then after that came an image of me greeting others who are joyfully as they float down through the river on rafts and inner tubes, down the river, down the stream. And then there was a idea of perhaps planting more greenery on the banks, like tall grasses, and making places for people to sit in the shade.
Beautiful imagery. I love that. I felt like you transported us. I want to be on that inner tube right now. That's incredible. Thank you so much, Nick. I love the way that spirit shows up for you. I receive a little bit of visual too, and I want to write and just let the words flow, but there are moments where I'm also just trying to capture the imagery that's coming through as I'm writing. So I'll share what I've written and then, see if I can describe for you a little bit of the imagery too. I wrote, change happens fast. You're on track toward a transition that has been building for some time. You likely feel this in your body. The anticipation of newness, experiences you don't have reference points for yet. In releasing expectations and past experiences, you're invited to suspend. Surrender to your internal compass as your inner truth unbinds you. Like the hanged man, becoming more like the fool. Take a leap of faith. When the opportunity comes, know that you are prepared and divinely guided with support from your highest self. And I wrote about those tarot cards because that was the imagery that I was being shown. I first saw this hanged man kind of imagery, right? Where it's in the traditional deck, you'll see the hanged man suspended with their face closer to the ground and their feet or ankles are kind of wrapped around the branch of a tree. And they're sort of hanging out in that space almost in meditation, there's a contentness to it too. And so I feel that it's almost as if you're in that hanged man space now. And there will be a moment where you're called to be more like the imagery that was then shown to me of the fool that's kind of this jester with their animal companion, usually represented by a dog, right? So you're familiar, that spirit kind of elements of nature also supporting that feeling of I can do anything, limitless potential. So yeah, it was kind of exciting and beautiful to see. It gave me the sensation that there is an opportunity on its way to you. And when that time comes, you'll know to make that shift or that leap. So that's what I have for you.
Yeah, no, I like that because I have felt kind of like the hanged man. I'm just like, how long do I have to just hang here? When do I get to be upright again and do the things that I want to do? It's felt very, yeah, suspended and bound is kind of how I
Yeah.
felt.
Yes. Yeah. And there's something to be said for the way you unbound yourself, right? Releasing that when the moment strikes, but also the intention and the purpose around being in that suspended, right? The trust that grows when you're suspended.
Yeah, yeah. It also makes me think about about a month ago, I had an injury where I fell and I hurt my neck, and it's still been a little sore. And I was talking to my yoga teacher about it the other day, and he was suggesting, doing inversions. So maybe I need to start doing some inversions, which is like the hanged man.
There you go.
Yeah, to really like embody that experience.
I love that. Sorry about your fall. That sounds scary. I'm glad you're on the mend, but ouch.
Oh yeah, yeah, I'm doing better now. Thank you. Well, thank you for the reading and for giving us the example of how you work with the Akashic Records. So is in terms of like doing a reading for a client, I imagine that this was a little bit more abridged since we're doing it in this format. Would you then like possibly have a second question come out of that and do more with a client, or how would that work?
Yeah, actually, generally, when I'm working with a client, we craft a series of questions before we go into the automatic writing process. So, generally speaking, it's 3 really hardy questions. Sometimes the length of time that we're allotted for the writing varies. And so it's sort of just personally catered to that person. If I feel that it would be beneficial to extend the 4 minutes to 7 minutes, sometimes that ends up being the case. And yeah, it's just unique to the individual, which I think is absolutely perfect. We kind of hash it out together.
I think the one thing I'd like to name and appreciate, Ruth, in the way that you're describing that you work with people is that you actually invite them to be accountable and a part of their magic, right? So by inviting Nick in to write, right, you're also inviting him to drop into his magic and medicine as well. And I love that accountability when it comes to the work, and you just really shine a light on that with that type of practice. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you for saying that, Tanya Mark. I do feel strongly about that. And you're right, it has to do with accountability. I also think it has a lot to do with agency, right? Because as I said before, if we're posing questions and Google's generating a plethora of responses, what stands out to me might not be the same as what stands out to the person that we're reading for. And so I think there's a lot to be said for the personal power that is afforded through collaborating with the records in this way instead of reading on behalf of someone. I think it is really essentially an invitation to have this person connect in their own way and also feel supported and empowered to be able to do that, with the idea that if it feels good and resonates, they can use this tool in their own time going forward, that, it's not necessary to constantly seek readers to tell you things that you kind of already know. But why not just affirm and support those internal responses that we all have?
Yeah, I love what you're both highlighting here. And I think it's really important, especially in a day and age when people are so willing to give their power away to authority in order to be told what to do or told what's right for them, that this is really, you know, it gives authority, it's empowering, it gives them ownership over their own process and their own internal wisdom. And then whatever feedback you give them is just sort of supporting what's already coming up for them. And I feel the same way when I do like hypnotherapy with people, like they're going through that process. I'm not telling them what they're seeing or what they're experiencing. They're having it internally. Or the same way if I teach people to do like trance journeying, they're having that experience themselves. I don't do the journey myself. I mean, I'm there with them, but I'm not bringing the information to them. I'm helping them find the information and the wisdom and the magic inside themselves.
I love that. It feels important to do it in that way. I love that you get to share that with your clients too, Nick. And I think it really does come back to what it means to be queer in a lot of ways, right? Because I think that it is queerness so much is this like pushing outside of limits and rigidity and structures and disrupting and dismantling them in a way that feels autonomous, that feels powerful and also collective, right? Like the collaborative component there, like that's to me so much of what it means for me to be queer. It's being in community.
It also makes me think about, bro, like how we work together in the records and reading for each other, how Ruth and I spend time cultivating connection in our own magic together, and as practitioners, the importance of that, right? But again, also honoring the energies of agency and accountability in that way. And it makes me think of that, that it's not about depending on one another as much as saying like, hey, we hold this medicine and magic that we love sharing. So let's be there and hold space for one another in that capacity as like this guiding light. And it's one of my favorite things to do with other practitioners. It's like, let's be in magic together. You know what I mean? Because it's such an important part of being a practitioner. How do we continue to evolve and spend time in magic, on our own, but also in community with one another? So it's one of my most favorite parts of our connection, bro, is that we do take time to drop into magic together. So
thank you, bro. It's my favorite too. I love it so much. And you're absolutely right. It's really, I've learned so much and felt so uplifted by the magic that you bring and how we get to share that together in a way that is kind of ever evolving. There's no stagnancy with it. I'm constantly learning and growing when we get to work in that capacity. And that's part of what I love so much about the records. I think that they're really supportive in that way. There's, again, not like a lot of rigidity in this practice. You really can use so many different divination tools in conjunction with the Akashic Records. The Akashic Records are just essentially a support tool that can amplify many different practices and rituals.
Yeah, I think that brings us to this really juicy part of the fact that listeners, we did open up the records, right? Ruth opened up the records before Sesh. And speaking of divination tools, Ruth is also a tarot reader. And we wanted to also add in the energy. If you're comfortable and it aligns, Ruth, like, would you be willing to do a reading for our queer collective and see what your decks and magic have to say in regards to queerness? And
I would absolutely love that, Tanya Mark. Thank you. Yes, I'd be honored. I think we were already talking earlier about sort of the energy that we've been working with as a collective in this present time. So I think it would be fun and kind of neat to share that and see what shows up.
Yes, please.
So I'll just name for time span for our listeners that this is being recorded the first week of September 2023. So that's when this reading is being given.
Beautiful. And for those astro heads and mystics who are aware of kind of what's going on cosmically, right? How the stars are aligned at the moment. We're really in the early stages of Virgo season. Venus has gone direct after a long period of being in retrograde. We're also in retrograde season with a lot of other planets. I'm not an astrologist, so I don't want to speak too much about it, but just kind of planting those seeds so that people can kind of carry that in mind and see what resonates for them. And with any reading, I think it's important to note that like there's going to be something that shows up that may or may not resonate for you, and that's okay. Take the parts of it that do and release the other parts, knowing that that's for someone else. So the question was, can you share again, Tanya Mark, what the question was for the collective? We just asking what is showing up right now energetically for us or what to focus on.
Yeah, maybe like some guidance on how to navigate, these upcoming time that we're in, these upcoming times that we're in as a queer community, yeah, some guidance on how we may continue to navigate forward.
Love it. Great question. Thank you. Yeah. So just asking for that guidance, clarity, support, and spirit. Let's see. So I'm going to talk about 3 things that have just come up as I've shuffled this deck. I'm using the Cosmic Tarot. It's by Norbert Losche, for anyone who's familiar with this deck. And some major arcanas came out. The first one I have is the Justice card. And I love this, how, again, kind of synchronistic with the timing, right? Like Virgo season does a lot to sort of prepare us for Libra season, which is all about balancing the scales, right? And so I think this is kind of highlighting what we might be anticipating and something that we can kind of shift our focus towards. So shifting our focus towards finding harmony and balance. There's some illustration of like a yin yang. There's this person that has this really focused gaze that almost has like a tunnel vision of light shining in 2 different directions. You have the sun in one corner and the moon in another. So I think it's also kind of highlighting that focus doesn't need to be specific on just one thing. You can be focusing on 2 things simultaneously. So light and dark, that yes and sort of energy that we spoke to earlier. And in the tarot, the Justice card is the 8th card of the major arcana. It's a really potent archetype that stands strongly on its own. The 8 I highlight because 8 generally does represent balance. If you look at the number 8, no matter how you slice it, it's perfectly symmetrical. And it also illustrates a bit of that, like infinity, right? The energy of infinity. When you flip the 8 on its side, it kind of details this coming and going and cyclical energy, right? Like we were talking about karma earlier. It kind of has that karmic energy connected with it too, right? So what I would take from this card in particular is just looking at areas in your life that could use a little extra focus and balance. How can you harmonize your desires, your interests, your goals, and your wishes, right? Like, how do we bring those things into alignment? And then the next card that popped up is the 3 of Swords. And in this, swords are usually indicating to us something that has to do with matters of the mind. Swords represent the element of air. And with air, we can think of, lines of communication, conversations. Also, just kind of want to highlight, there's 3 of us here, and all 3 of us are air signs. And in this card, you kind of have a meeting of minds, right? There are 3 kind of energies being illustrated coming forward, and they all have a sword that is pointed and focused at the same center. And so I think this really sort of highlights the perhaps an area in the collective's lives where there's a meeting of minds. And with the swords, there is also a sense of duality, which is interesting when we're looking at the Justice card in conjunction with the Three of Swords, right? Swords have this double-edgedness to them. And so looking at how our lines of communication might have a little double-edgedness to them as well, right? So when I look at swords in the tarot, I immediately think to the third eye and the throat chakras. So thoughts and visions in the third eye, and voicing and communicating with the throat. And so if we're being approached with opportunities for important conversations, or speaking our truth, or being in our conviction, establishing and maintaining boundaries, those are sort of the themes that come to mind when I look at the Three of Swords. So I think there is an invitation here. If you are someone who tends to communicate with a lot of tenderness and maybe even a little bit of people pleasing, this card is inviting you to be a little bit more strong in your lines of communication, to get a little bit more clear and direct. And on the contrary, if you're someone who maybe tends to lean into sharp communication and, instinctual conversations, the invitation then might be to pause and reframe how you're going to approach those. What I'm sensing is a very necessary and important communication. So the last card I have here is the Magician. And I love this. The Magician it's the number 1 of the major arcana. So this usually indicates a new beginning, right? 1 being like, let's go. We're just getting started. And Magician energy is very much an energy of master manifester. And I choose the word manifesting carefully. I know that it has its own kind of connotations attached with it, and it's used very freely in a lot of our kind of spiritual spaces. But I want to kind of focus on the way manifesting really taps into your inner power and abilities. There is a lot of intuitive and almost psychic energy connected with the Magician, right? So there's also that invitation for folks in the collective to recognize their own inner magic. What gifts and abilities do you bring to your life, to your circle, to your relationships? And again, with the swords being present here and the Justice card being present here, I think that there is a lot to be said for how we're rewriting stories and creating new beginnings with a sense of truth and diplomacy and fairness and equity, and really having that be the focus. And interestingly enough, you have this infinity symbol illustrated around the third eye of the Magician. This is also illustrated in the traditional deck right at the crown space above the head. So there's a lot of divine influence and support guiding that action and movement, right? The Magician is wielding all of the tools. When you look at the Magician card, the pentacles are present, the cups are present, the swords and the wands are also present. So considering that as well, looking at your own personal toolkit, all of the elements, and how they can support this inspired action, because there is a nudge here that something is ready to shift. And there is a change that's becoming available, but I think it's going to require a lot of tact, a lot of mindfulness, and just leaning in again to your own personal strengths, gifts, abilities, and allowing communication to come through with support and ease and flow. So that's the reading. That's what I have for the collective.
Yeah. So as a visual person, I love the first card and the third card have a very similar visual representation, that they both have the light coming out of the eyes and in the same sort of way. And it's kind of got this pyramid shape. And then they both have kind of the infinity symbol. And that, you know, the first one was all about justice and balance. And then this is creating balance. And then in the middle, you have clear and direct communication, right? Or shifting communication. So I just love that visually as a balance and representation of the reading too.
Yeah, and when you were sharing, the thing that dropped for me was the way that we restore balance is through mindful communication and mindful navigation of our toolkits. So it just really brought it home. Yeah, so important as a queer community. Thank you for dropping that, Ruth, so much. Like, really, we're coming to a close, and we like to kind of close with asking, you know, something fun, something kind of blah, blah, blah. And when you were reading, it was interesting. I went back to this visual of you as a first grader queer person. And I was wondering if there was any queer medicine and magic that the Ruth today would want to drop to that Ruth as a first grader.
I love that. Thank you for that sentiment, because that actually brings a lot of warmth and watery also energy as I'm thinking about little Ruthie. I described how much joy I got from being on a stage and performing and like tapping into other facets of who I am in the performance kind of way, and like actually stepping into a character. And I think that I would want to continue to support little Ruthie in being free to explore and also to take up space, to shine, to get on the stage more. That's probably something that I needed to be reminded of. So thank you for asking that. That feels really sweet.
Of course, bro, of course.
Well, Ruth, before we let you go, can you share with people where they can find you and connect with you?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I am on Instagram. I may not be very active from the looks of my grid, but I'm active. I'm there. You can reach me at Ruth Camillia. It's CAMILLIA on Instagram. I also have a website, which is also just www.ruthcamillia.com. And you can also book a discovery call for free, 20 minutes to just get on a phone call and talk about whatever you might be looking for support or guidance around, and maybe looking at the various tools that we can explore together. That's what I got.
Great. Well, we'll have those links in the show notes for people. But thank you so much for being here and sharing your divination tools and doing the reading for me and for our queer collective.
Thank you so much for your trust and for giving the space and all of the energy that the two of you shared. I'm so happy to be in community with you both.
Resources that we share today can be found in our show notes and at thequeerspirit.com.
You're invited to follow our show on Apple Podcasts or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time, much love and blessings. Aho.